Video coming to you live from the inside of the Dodge. And what a wonderful place it is to be. Now, if you guys follow me on Instagram, you probably saw that I did a very major road trip. And if you watch my YouTube channel, you know that I was doing a lot of stuff to this truck to get it ready for said road trip. However, like I said, if you watch both Instagram and YouTube, you may notice that that road trip was not done in this Dodge. And in this video, I'm going to explain why, and we're going to get into some more nitty-gritty details. Check it out. So in the last videos, you saw me doing a ton of work on the Dodge. I'll show you some clips here as I talk just to kind of remind you. If you haven't seen that, definitely go back and check out those videos. But basically, I picked this truck up. It didn't run. I got it running, did some very basic maintenance, got it on the road, and then decided with a very lofty goal that I was going to go ahead and take it on a 1,200-mile road trip. So I went and started doing a ton of additional work and maintenance on this truck to get it ready for the road trip. And in the last video, I was doing all kinds of stuff. And up until maybe 3 days prior to leaving, I was dead set on taking this truck. Really, the only thing I was going to do differently is I noticed that the oil pressure after installing the gauges, I'll show you the gauges right now, actually, so you can kind of see what they look like. I noticed that the oil pressure was a little bit low at idle. So here's a shot of those gauges that I installed. And if you remember from the last video, or I think it was the last video, basically, we had 3 gauge pod and I wanted 4 because I wanted to be able to tell the fuel level. So I went and installed, kind of like made my own 4 gauge pod. Disregard this, it actually runs nice and cool, but it's been shut off right now. So it's an analog gauge, so it's showing warmer, but if I were to kick it back on, it would drop. Anyways, the oil pressure I noticed, cold, I was at like 60 PSI of cold oil pressure, but when it got nice and up to temp around 195 degrees and I idled it, it would drop down here below 10 PSI, like 7 or 8, which I really didn't love. So I decided kind of last minute to change the oil. So I'm changing the oil and, you know, I'm like, all right, I'm going to put some heavier weight oil in it just to be safe. I had 1030 in it before. I was like, I'll put some Lucas 2050 in it. That stuff is way thicker. I happened to be over at my parents' house at the time. They live right down the road. And I threw some oil in it and I was about ready to hit the road and say bye. And I go to start the truck, nothing. And well, not nothing. It cranked, but it would not fire. I couldn't get to start. And sometimes with carbureted vehicles, folks who've had carbureted cars and trucks, you might notice that, you know, sometimes your cold start is really dependent on your choke settings. If your choke settings are right and your accelerator pump works, typically, unless it's way too cold, it'll start no problem. Similarly, if the car has been running for a little bit and you just shut it off for a second, like to get fuel or something and turn it back on, usually they'll start up too. Now, sometimes carbureted cars will do a thing where if it has been sitting for a while, it can boil the fuel in the bowls and like vapor lock. So you'll crank it and you'll have a lot of issues with that like hot start where it's been sitting for a little bit. Once it cools back down, typically it's okay. That's what I figured it was, but I could not get it to start. It's really weird. So I took a timing light, I hooked the timing light up to it and I was cranking it and I wasn't seeing any flashes even when cranking. I was like, that's weird, right? And then for the heck of it, I decided, you know what? I'm going to like pour some fuel in the carburetor to see. And when I poured fuel in the carburetor, it would start. I was like, that's weird. Ran for a few seconds and then would die. Very odd. It's gonna be really hard to see, but the fuel pump is down in there. Anyways, I thought it might be the fuel pump. I pulled the fuel pump off and I decided that I was gonna go ahead and swap a fuel pump on it. They're like 20 bucks. It looked like I may have a leak on the inlet side, so maybe it was just sucking in air. It wasn't able to prime the pump and that was causing a fuel starvation issue. I went to go and replace the pump and wouldn't you know it, I stripped out the fitting on the timing cover. And that was like 2 days before the trip. So at that point I had a non-running vehicle. This thing was not running. It was like 2 days before the trip. To do this right, I knew I was either gonna have to do, honestly to do it right, I probably needed to put a new timing cover on it, and just things were not looking good for my 1,200 mile trip that I really didn't want to be left stranded on. Because like I said, I had all the tools at my disposal and I could not get this thing running. And I didn't want that to happen to me when I was in the middle of nowhere. So very unfortunately, I decided, you know what, we're going to can this and we're going to take our other truck on the road trip. And I'll show you some cool videos right here as I'm talking, some aerial shots we took. That road trip was super awesome. We had a really good time. 1,200 miles we hit, tons of state parks, tons of national parks in Utah and Arizona. Super cool trip. So I get back and I'm going to show you a little bit more of what we found out. It wasn't just one thing. So we get back, I decide I am going to use not a helicoil, but what's called an easy lock, and replace the threads on that. I get that installed. I verify at this point that I have fuel going to the carburetor, which is great news. I still have no spark, okay? I have no spark, and worse, when cranking, I'm not getting full voltage to the coil. The way these are working, or the way these are set up, you should get through your ballast resistor, which we'll talk about this new stuff over here in a second. But the way that these should work is when you're cranking, you bypass the ballast resistor through the pink wire, and the pink wire sends full voltage to your coil. Once you let off the key and it goes to run, then you send power to the coil through the ballast resistor, and that's at roughly 6 volts. So that's how it's supposed to work, but I was not seeing full voltage while cranking. I really started to dig into troubleshooting, thinking maybe I had a bad ignition switch, maybe I had a corroded connection at the firewall connector. I kept tracing all the wires, and what I found was, if you come over here, coming into my starter relay, I had the correct voltage when cranking. Coming out of my starter relay, I did not. So I replaced the starter relay, I rechecked the voltage when cranking, and I found that I had the right amount of voltage. So at this point, I've replaced the fuel pump. I've also replaced the starter relay. It now has 12 volts. It now has fuel. It still will not run. So I am checking everything. I checked the ground to the coil. I checked the wires. I checked the connections to the distributor. I checked the coil itself. We actually wound up replacing the coil. And I had ordered, before I went on the road trip, an electronic ignition conversion, which comes with the correct distributor. It comes with a new ballast resistor. It comes with the ignition box and all of the wiring. So I didn't want to just keep throwing parts at it. So I kept troubleshooting, and I narrowed it down to it was either the ignition box or the distributor. So I pulled those back out. I go ahead and I installed the new ignition box, which is set up for electronic ignition. So this removes the points condenser, and the new distributor. I wire everything up. I go to start it, and it fires up immediately. It doesn't even crank, it just fires. So I am going to go and try and troubleshoot if it was the distributor or if it was this ignition box, but the new ignition box comes with the wiring pigtails to everything. So you'll see I went through in here and actually cleaned this up a little bit. It's not my absolute best work, but I went and deleted all of the old wiring that was coming out of here. I redid this entire 2 looms. So basically from your firewall connector, I've got a new ballast resistor. I made sure to fix the connection. Somebody had some really janky connections here, and they had 2 positive leads that were going to nothing, that were like a potential short waiting to happen. So I redid the connectors here for both of these. New ignition box, new plug, new pigtail, redid all of this wiring, put new leads on the positive and negative sides of the coil, which you can't see with that pink wire there. I also found that I had some funky wiring that was mixed up from the voltage regulator back to the alternator. I got that sorted out. In the end, I think honestly what it was, oh, here's the other thing. When I pulled the old distributor out, expecting to see points, it had a condenser on it, next to the coil, but I was expecting to see points. There were no points in there. It was actually an electronic ignition. So I think at some point, somebody went in here, they had the old style coil with a condenser. They had an electronic distributor. I think they just had a part store ignition box, which was not set up for the electronic ignition, all hodgepodge. I do think I had a fueling issue, and I had an old starter relay. And at some point, somebody had replaced the starter relay and left the old one on the firewall. It was super weird. I think somebody was trying to work on this that really didn't know what they were doing and didn't troubleshoot it properly. And it ran okay enough until I got it, and then it died right before the road trip. So now we've got it all running. We've got it all back together. We're just trying to put some miles on it. That 2050 oil definitely seemed to help. Cruising around today, I'm seeing it like 50 miles an hour, 40 PSI, hot oil pressure, which is great. At idle, it's like 12 to 14. So I think just running this thing is gonna help. The starter sounds a little tired, so we might try and address that soon. And I've been watching some Richard Holdner videos on different upgrades you can do on these. These 360s are really choked from the factory in the 1970s. So this is a 2-barrel carburetor, really kind of crappy manifolds. Mopar did have a 4-barrel carburetor that was pretty solid, or 4-barrel intake. But if I can get a cheap 4-barrel like Edelbrock intake and like some you know, a set of headers and stuff like that. Just little things. It's got an exhaust leak right now, but like I think some improvements would really make this thing run a lot better. But for right now, we took it out to a car show. I'll show you some videos right there, and you know, just enjoyed it. We're gonna keep driving it. Unfortunately, we couldn't make the road trip, but we'll make the next one. So hey guys, that's the update. Hope you enjoyed this video. Sorry we couldn't bring you all that cool footage on the road, but sometimes that happens. And but don't worry, we'll have plenty more videos with Bert, aka Colonel Mustard, in the future.